Mark Carney just got up and left. Not from a press briefing, not from a parliamentary session, not from a phone call managed through diplomatic intermediaries operating at a comfortable remove. From a face-to-face bilateral trade summit with the United States. A summit that Washington had spent 6 weeks actively requesting. A summit that the White House had publicly described as the defining opportunity to resolve the most economically destructive trade conflict in the modern history of North America. A summit that 417,000 American workers, whose livelihoods depend entirely on the bilateral trade relationship, were counting on to protect their livelihoods. Carney read the American proposal. He closed the folder. He stood up from the table, and he walked through the door without speaking a single word. In doing so, he delivered the most consequential negotiating act in the recorded history of the two countries' relationship. The walkout was recorded by a single pool camera positioned inside the summit's main conference room. The footage, 11 seconds of Mark Carney rising from his chair, buttoning his jacket, sliding the American proposal folder to the center of the table, as though returning something that had been sent to the wrong address, and walking through the door without a backward glance, became the most viewed diplomatic recording in internet history within 6 hours of its release. No speech, no accusation, no theatrical confrontations staged for cameras, just a man exiting a room with the settled finality of someone who had concluded that the conversation on offer was not worth participating in. What do you believe gave Carney the confidence to walk away from a summit that so many American workers were depending on? Was it a calculated strategy, a genuine principle, or something that defies a single clean explanation? Tell me in the comments below. The American delegation remained frozen in their chairs for 4 full seconds after the door closed. The expression on the face of the U.S. trade representative, captured in high definition by that same pool camera, communicated more about where the power in this relationship actually sits than any official statement from either government ever could. Warren Buffett described the walkout as the single most powerful negotiating move he had witnessed in 70 years of business. Then he explained the underlying principle that every serious negotiator understands intuitively and that the White House apparently never absorbed. The ability to walk away is not a tactic available to skilled negotiators. It is the definition of leverage itself. The party that cannot leave the table holds no meaningful power regardless of the size of its economy, the volume of its demands, or the forcefulness of its rhetoric. But it is what Carney said afterward. 8 words delivered at a press conference 45 minutes after he left the building, spoken with the composed calm of a man who understood precisely what he had just accomplished, that will be studied in negotiation programs and diplomatic training for the next half-century. When you understand what was actually contained in the American proposal that prompted Carney to stand up, why 417,000 American workers now have no diplomatic channel working to protect their positions, and what Buffett says about the irreversible consequences of discovering that the other side no longer needs you, you will understand why this was not a failed summit. This was the moment Canada demonstrated it had already moved on before anyone in Washington realized the departure had happened. I'm going to walk you through exactly what happened in that room because the precise sequence of events shows something much more significant than a diplomatic insult or a routine negotiating breakdown. The summit was convened at a neutral venue, the Fairmont Chateau Laurier in Ottawa. A location in Canada was selected, and the United States accepted only after the White House's initial preference for a Washington venue was declined by the Canadian side. The American delegation was led by the U.S. Trade Representative, accompanied by the Commerce Secretary, the Treasury Undersecretary for International Affairs, and a team of 14 senior trade negotiators. The Canadian side consisted of Carney, the Finance Minister, the Trade Minister, and a team of 8. The size disparity between delegations was itself a signal before a single word was exchanged. The United States brought 14 negotiators to a meeting that Canada staffed with 8, an asymmetry that suggested Washington had prepared for a complex, extended, multi-track negotiation. Canada had prepared for something considerably shorter. The summit opened with 15 minutes of formal diplomatic warmth, the choreographed pleasantries that precede serious bilateral discussions between allied nations, handshakes, photographs, carefully worded statements about enduring partnership and mutual commitment to resolution. Then the American delegation presented its proposal. The document was 61 pages. It had been prepared across 4 weeks by the Trade Representative's Office in coordination with the White House, the Commerce Department, and the National Economic Council. According to administration officials who briefed reporters in advance of the summit, it represented a comprehensive framework for restoring the bilateral trade relationship to its full potential. The proposal was distributed to the Canadian delegation in hard copy. Carney opened the folder, began reading, and the room went quiet. What the proposal contained, and what the Canadian delegation subsequently described in a detailed public briefing that was itself a carefully calculated act of exposure, was not a framework for restoring anything. It was a framework for Canadian capitulation packaged in the vocabulary of partnership. The proposal demanded that Canada reduce its retaliatory tariffs to 0 within 30 days, while American tariffs on Canadian goods would be phased down over 36 months, subject to compliance benchmarks that Washington would define and measure. Canada would disarm immediately, while the United States retained its full tariff arsenal for 3 additional years. It demanded that Canada align its trade diversification agreements with bilateral compatibility requirements, language that trade lawyers immediately identified as a call for Canada to subordinate its newly established partnerships with the European Union, Japan, South Korea, and India to American approval authority. It demanded Canadian participation in a joint trade oversight commission with an American-appointed chair and American veto power over Canadian trade policy decisions. This governance architecture would effectively transfer control of Canadian trade relationships with the rest of the world to Washington. It demanded that Canada normalize energy export pricing to pre-conflict market rates. This demand ignored the documented reality that Canada was now receiving substantially higher prices from European and Asian buyers than it had ever received from the United States, and that normalizing to pre-conflict rates would mean Canada voluntarily accepting below-market valuations for its resources at the expense of Americans. It demanded suspension of Canada's participation in the commodity settlement framework, the parallel financial infrastructure Carney had constructed to reduce the global dependence on dollar-denominated trade. And it demanded, in a provision that the Canadian delegation later described as the precise moment the Prime Minister stopped reading, that Canada issue a public statement acknowledging the United States' legitimate economic interest in Canadian trade policy and reaffirming the bilateral relationship as the foundation of Canadian international economic engagement. The proposal did not invite Canada to negotiate. It invited Canada to surrender its sovereignty, dismantle its new international alliances, abandon the financial architecture it had built, accept below-market prices for its natural resources, and publicly declare that the Canadian economy exists in a position of structural subordination to American interests. It asked for everything and offered in return nothing except the partial, conditional, delayed removal of tariffs that had already been demonstrated to damage the United States more than Canada. Carney read for 9 minutes. The room held its silence. At minute 9, he closed the folder. He did not look up at the American delegation. He did not make eye contact with the trade representative. He placed both hands flat on the table surface, paused for 2 seconds, slid the folder toward the center of the table, stood up, buttoned his jacket, and walked through the door. The finance minister and trade minister followed. The 8-member Canadian delegation cleared the room in under 15 seconds. No one raised their voice. No one made a statement, no door was closed with force. The silence was the statement. And the silence communicated something that no prepared remarks could have delivered with equivalent precision. This proposal is not worth responding to. This negotiation is not worth engaging in. And you are not in any position to be presenting demands. The American delegation remained in their seats for nearly a full minute after the Canadians departed. The pool camera captured the trade representative turning toward the Commerce Secretary with an expression that political observers later described as that of a man who had just understood that he had been sent to a negotiation carrying a document specifically designed to ensure there would be no negotiation. One member of the American delegation, a career trade negotiator with service across 4 administrations, was later quoted by colleagues as saying, upon reading the proposal for the first time during the flight to Ottawa, he had thought, if I were seated on the other side of this table, I would leave too. This is not a proposal. This is an ultimatum in PDF format. 45 minutes after departing the summit, Carney held a press conference at the Canadian Parliament. He appeared composed, almost entirely still. He spoke for 3 minutes, the shortest formal public statement of his tenure as Prime Minister, and every sentence carried the weight of someone who understood that brevity in this specific moment was more devastating than any extended remarks. He said, "This morning, the United States presented Canada with a document it called a proposal. In my career, as a central banker, as a financial regulator, as a head of government, I have read many proposals. A proposal implies 2 parties. A proposal implies a negotiation. A proposal implies that both sides have something to offer and something to gain. What was presented this morning was not a proposal. It was a demand for capitulation, comprehensive, unconditional, and offered in exchange for nothing except the partial reversal of measures that have damaged the American economy more than the Canadian economy." He continued with the clinical precision that had become his public signature, but now carrying something closer to finality, the register of a man who is not opening a new chapter, but closing one. Canada has spent 18 months constructing an economy that does not depend on American trade goodwill. We have new partners, we have new markets, we have a new financial infrastructure, we have new energy export corridors, we have a diversified, internationally integrated economy that did not exist 2 years ago, and that exists specifically because the United States made dependence on American partnership too structurally dangerous to sustain. We built alternatives. The alternatives function. And we did not build them to dismantle them the moment Washington decided it was prepared to talk. Then came the 8 words. Carney looked directly into the camera, the same direct-to-lens address that had become the defining visual signature of his most consequential public moments, and said, with the quiet, unperformative finality of a verdict that has already been delivered and carries no avenue of appeal, "We didn't walk out. We moved on." 8 words. No performance, no visible anger, no theatrical defiance. Just the calm, factual declaration of a country that had already located its future somewhere else and was no longer waiting for authorization from the nation that had driven it to look. Within 9 minutes, the phrase was spreading globally. Within an hour, it was the leading headline across every major financial and political publication in the world. The Financial Times. 8 words that ended an era. The Economist. The walkout that proved Canada had already left. Bloomberg. The moment the bilateral relationship became history. Here is why the walkout carries structural significance beyond symbolism, beyond footage, beyond the phrases trending across every platform. 417,000 American jobs are directly tied to the bilateral trade relationship with Canada. That figure comes from Bureau of Labor Statistics data cross-referenced with Commerce Department trade flow analysis and Federal Reserve regional employment reporting. It includes 112,000 positions in automotive manufacturing, dependent on cross-border supply chains. 87,000 in the energy and petrochemical sectors are reliant on Canadian crude and natural gas, 63,000 in agriculture and food processing, dependent on Canadian inputs, wheat, canola, potash, livestock, 41,000 in logistics and transportation, moving goods across the border in both directions. The remaining 114,000 are distributed across the manufacturing, technology, construction, and service sectors, whose operations depend in whole or in part on the functioning bilateral trade relationship. Those 417,000 workers were counting on this summit, not in an abstract policy sense, in the specific, immediate, concrete sense that their employers had been communicating to them for weeks that a negotiated resolution was the only realistic barrier between their current employment and a sequence of layoffs, plant closures, contract cancellations, and the cascading economic deterioration that follows when a trade relationship representing $700 billion annually loses its diplomatic framework. The summit was meant to be the first day of restoration. Carney's departure ended it before the first hour was complete, and the specific, documented, incontestable reason is that the United States arrived at the table not with a genuine offer, but with terms for surrender, and in doing so revealed that 18 months of Canadian economic transformation had produced no equivalent transformation in American strategic thinking. Washington came to the table believing it was extending a form of rescue to Canada. Canada arrived and discovered it was being asked to return everything it had built in exchange for a conditional promise of partial future relief. And Canada said no, not with words, but with movement. With the sound of a chair moving back from a table, with a door closing, and with a country that had already built its future somewhere else, walking in that direction. The American workers left in the middle, the 417,000 whose positions depend on a trade relationship that now has no active diplomatic process to stabilize it, became the immediate focal point of domestic political fury. The governor of Michigan, whose state represents the largest single concentration of Canada-dependent manufacturing employment in the country, held a press conference within 3 hours. His voice remained controlled. His anger was directed with precision. He said, 417,000 American workers woke up this morning expecting their government had sent a serious proposal to Ottawa. Their government sent a document demanding that Canada surrender everything it had built and receive nothing credible in return. Of course, Carney left. Anyone with alternatives would leave. My workers are going to pay the price for the arrogance of people in Washington who still believe they can pressure their way to outcomes when they no longer hold the cards that pressure requires. The governor of Ohio was more direct. His state has 41,000 workers whose employment depends on the Canadian trade relationship. He said the White House had one opportunity, one summit, one moment, to begin repairing the most consequential bilateral economic relationship in the hemisphere. They sent a proposal so poorly calibrated to the current reality that the Canadian Prime Minister read it for 9 minutes and concluded it was not worth engaging. 9 minutes. His workers' livelihoods deserved a government that understood the operational difference between making demands and making a proposal. This one, apparently, does not. Republican senators from affected states who had already broken with the White House over the Canada Trade Normalization Act responded with a directness and personal intensity sharper than any prior criticism they had offered. Senator Erickson of Iowa said, "I spent 6 months telling my farmers that a negotiated resolution was imminent. I told them to hold their position. I told them the summit would produce a credible path forward. And now I learn that the proposal Washington sent was so one-sided that the Canadian Prime Minister sat with it for 9 minutes and then left. My farmers are not interested in sovereignty clauses and oversight commissions. They are interested in market access. And this White House just destroyed the only remaining diplomatic channel that could have helped deliver it. Warren Buffett's response addressed the negotiation architecture of the walkout with the authority of a man who had spent 7 decades on both sides of consequential negotiating tables and who recognized in Carney's 11-second exit the single most powerful move available in any negotiation, the demonstrated, credible, operational willingness to walk away. He did not address trade policy. He did not engage with tariff schedules, sovereignty language, or diplomatic protocol. He discussed leverage, its nature, its origin, and why the capacity to walk away is not one instrument of leverage among many, but the foundational source from which all other leverage is derived. In 70 years of business, Buffett said, I have sat across from the other side of thousands of negotiations, acquisitions, partnerships, joint ventures, supply arrangements, licensing agreements, every configuration in which two parties attempt to reach terms. And across all of those negotiations, over all of those decades, I have arrived at one conclusion that overrides every tactic, every framework, every technique described in every negotiation manual ever produced. The party that can leave wins, not the party with the larger balance sheet, not the party with the greater market share, not the party with superior political leverage, military capability, or any other conventional measure of power, the party that can leave. Because leaving is the one move in any negotiation that has no counter, you can meet a demand with a counter-demand. You can meet a threat with a counter-threat. You can answer an argument with a competing argument. You cannot answer someone walking out of the room. When they leave, the negotiation concludes, and the only question that persists is which side needed the agreement more. He then applied the principle with surgical specificity. Carney walked out because he was in a position to walk out. That is the entire analysis. Everything surrounding it, the sovereignty clauses, the one-sided terms, the demand for institutional capitulation, is context. The foundational fact is simpler and more decisive than any of that context. Canada has built alternatives. Canada has new trading partners operating at scale. Canada has new energy buyers paying market prices. Canada has a financial infrastructure that functions outside the dollar-denominated framework. Canada spent 18 months constructing an economy capable of operating without American participation as its central assumption. The United States has not constructed an equivalent economy capable of operating without Canadian participation. That asymmetry is the only variable that matters in a negotiation. Carney could afford to leave. The United States could not afford to have him leave. And when one party can afford to leave and the other cannot, the party in the latter position should never present terms that give the former party a reason to want to. Buffett went further, explaining that the American proposal was not merely insulting in diplomatic terms, but also strategically self-destructive. If you are the party that needs the agreement, and the United States needs this agreement, 417,000 jobs need it, American farmers, manufacturers, and energy sector workers need it, then your proposal should make it straightforward for the other side to say yes. Your proposal should be constructed to keep the other party in the room. It should give them something worth staying for. What the United States produced instead was a document so weighted in one direction that it gave the other side not just a reason to leave, but a justification that the entire world could evaluate and understand. Carney didn't simply walk out. He walked out holding the moral high ground, the strategic high ground, and documentary proof in the form of a 61-page proposal that the United States was not negotiating in any recognizable sense of the word. The proposal didn't fail to bring Canada back to the table. It gave Canada institutional permission to remain gone. The market reaction was immediate and structural, rather than momentary and sentiment-driven. The US dollar weakened by 2.1% against the Canadian dollar within 48 hours. The largest bilateral currency movement between the two nations in over a decade, reflecting institutional investors' view that the failed summit had eliminated the last credible pathway to trade normalization under the current administration. American equities in sectors dependent on Canadian trade, automotive, energy, agriculture, and manufacturing, declined between 3 and 7% as analysts revised the probability of resolution downward from uncertain to unlikely within the current political cycle. The S&P 500 fell 1.4% on the day of the walkout. Goldman Sachs issued a note to clients that captured the market's collective assessment in a single sentence. The last diplomatic off-ramp just closed. Supply chain disruptions that had been manageable under the operating assumption of eventual resolution became structurally unmanageable under the reality of diplomatic collapse. American auto manufacturers announced production schedule reductions at 11 plants across 6 states. Energy companies in the northeastern United States activated winter contingency protocols designed as temporary measures that now appeared to describe the permanent operating environment. Agricultural exporters who had been holding inventory in anticipation of restored Canadian market access began liquidating at discounted prices to alternative buyers, locking in losses that would move through rural economies for the remainder of the growing season. The 417,000 jobs that had been characterized as at risk before the summit were now assessed by 3 separate economic forecasting firms as in active jeopardy, a distinction that marks the difference between a risk that might materialize and a consequence that is materializing in real time. So here's the current state of the situation. The United States requested a bilateral trade summit with Canada. Canada agreed. The United States presented a 61-page document demanding Canadian capitulation on tariffs, trade diversification agreements, energy pricing, financial infrastructure, and national sovereignty, offering in return nothing except the conditional, partial, and delayed removal of measures that have demonstrably damaged the American economy more than the Canadian economy. Mark Carney read the proposal for 9 minutes, closed the folder, stood up, and left the room without speaking. 45 minutes later, he stood in front of the world and delivered 8 words that are now on the front page of every major publication on Earth. We didn't walk out. We moved on. 417,000 American workers now have no active diplomatic process working on their behalf. No summit to reschedule. No indication from the Canadian side of any interest in returning to a table that offered nothing worth staying for. And Warren Buffett explained with 7 decades of evidence behind him exactly why walking away is the most powerful move available in any negotiation, because it is the one move with no counter, and the one move that only the party with real alternatives can execute. Can the United States bring Canada back to the negotiating table after presenting terms so disconnected from the current reality that the Canadian Prime Minister read them for 9 minutes and determined they were not worth a response? If it can, what would a credible proposal look like from a government that has spent 18 months demonstrating it does not understand the operational difference between negotiating and demanding? Can the 417,000 American workers whose employment depends on this relationship survive the absence of a diplomatic resolution? And if they cannot, who bears the responsibility? The country that left the room, or the country that sent a proposal constructed to drive it out? And the question that will define the next chapter of this confrontation, when one side has already moved on, and the other side is still seated at a table holding a 61-page document that no one is returning to read, who is actually trapped? The administration tried to bring Canada to the table on American terms. It demonstrated instead that American terms are no longer the relevant ones. It tried to use the summit to reverse 18 months of Canadian economic diversification. It demonstrated instead that the diversification is complete, functional, and not reversible by a single diplomatic session. It tried to show the world that the United States still controls the shape of this relationship. It showed the world a 61-page document read for 9 minutes and left on a table in Ottawa. And it handed Mark Carney the 8 words that will define how power actually operates in the 21st century. 8 words that every negotiator, every diplomat, every business leader, and every nation that has been told it cannot survive without American partnership now understands with absolute clarity. We didn't walk out, we moved on.